When RTX Remix was first announced, I always wondered which games modders would apply that tool to first, and I was super psyched when I saw that a community of collaborators had taken Painkiller from 2004 and enhanced it to make Painkiller RTX. Still work in progress as of version 0.1.6, this mod uses RTX Remix as well as modified textures and assets to add fully real-time lighting into the game via path tracing, greatly changing the game's visuals. Now, the whole reason why RTX Remix works with Painkiller is due to its special custom engine, nicknamed the Pain Engine. The 2004 release from the Polish People Can Fly Studios was built around DirectX 8.1, which gave it its stellar visuals for the time. Bloom effects, specular lighting with limited bump mapping, and full frame buffer distortion effects. Those visuals dazzled top-end GPU owners back in the day, but like a great number of PC releases from that era, it had a DirectX 7 fallback, which would cull the fancier shading effects and run on older GPUs like the original GeForce. RTX Remix uses that fixed function DX7 path that the Paint Engine had to hook into the game and replace the core rendering with the path tracer. That is how I've been playing the game these last few days, taking in the sights and sounds of Painkiller with a new lick of paint that has made me appreciate it all the more in 2025. It is quite a special game that history has kind of forgotten. For those of you in the audience who do not know a lot about Painkiller, perhaps since you maybe did not game on PC back then, Painkiller is a primarily single-player first-person shooter that was patently transgressive. I do not say that only because it has the art style and hyper-violence that a nu metal-obsessed teenager could dream up. Rather, I say that Painkiller was transgressive because its campaign's gameplay was bucking trends of that time period. Post-Half-Life and post-Halo Combat Evolved, many first-person shooters were trending toward a more grounded, storytelling-based design. And the classic shooter franchises like Doom, Quake, or Unreal had gone on to become either wholly focused on multiplayer or to be Half-Life-likes, such as what Doom 3 essentially became. Painkiller took all those modern trappings and threw them in the garbage, and was much more old school. Story exists only in the loose sense, where there are these pre-rendered FMVs that bookend the game's chapters, and these FMVs only act as a flimsy excuse to send you, the player, to visually distinct levels that pretty much have no thematic linking beyond, these are bad guys and you need to shoot them till they are dead. I mean, on one level you're shooting giant biker dudes with Tommy guns in a prison that would make even the most hardcore Plutonia veteran sweat, and on the next level you are pulping blow dart toting ninjas, samurai demons, and off-brand head crabs in an opera house. The thematic variety to the environments and enemies is a key part of the game's charm, much in the way it was for games like Daikatana, except this game tends to play a lot better than that one did, at least. The basic gameplay will sound familiar if you ever played Doom Eternal or Doom 2016. Enter a room, which then closes itself shut and turns into a combat arena. Then, using your devastating arsenal and a lot of backpedaling, or bunny hopping, you have to defeat every one of the monsters spawned there to continue on to the next room. It's simple on paper, but thanks to the enemy variety and level variety, and of course the incredible weaponry, it doesn't really get tiring. It can even be unintentionally hilarious at times, like watching an enemy do some elaborate somersault to get closer to you, only to be rapidly disassembled by a shotgun blast. The game enhanced its traditional FPS gameplay back in the day with an extensive use of havoc physics, where a great deal of the game's environmental objects could be broken up into tiny pieces with rigid body movement on all those little fragments, or environmental objects could be manipulated with ragdoll or rope physics. Sometimes it was just there for purely visual entertainment, but other times it had a gameplay purpose, with destructible objects often containing valuable resources or being useful as physics weapons against enemies. There is something fascinating how games from the mid-2000s could often have a surprising amount of mundane and subtle physics interactions in them, even if it only meant a little heightened sense of immersion for the curious player. That largely disappeared in the 2010s and is refreshing to see in 2025 with greatly enhanced lighting. Back in 2004, any moving objects tended to look rather out of the place in the otherwise baked environmental lighting, like these barrels here which glow in the dark in the 2004 version. Now with the RTX Remix in the game, those barrels sit in with the environment quite well and do not disturb the dark atmosphere. So what does this RTX version of the rendering bring to the game? Let us first start with the more obvious point in lighting. Painkiller's 2004 original release relied on nearly fully baked lighting with scarcely any moving lights and no real-time perspective correct shadows. So that being added into the mix from Remix really adds a whole new dimension to the game's visual package. Just take a look at the game's first level. In the original renderer, this level is of course very dark, where each of the lanterns has a facsimile of light emitting from them. Around these lanterns, artists did place a couple colored sprite particles to simulate the look of light lighting up fog on this foggy day. To maintain a similar look in the RTX renderer, here the artists used ray-traced fog volumes to cover a similar role, where you can see now that the fog is lit and conforms to the shape of the lights that are embedded into them, showing shadows in the fog and areas where light is obscured. Another thing you might notice is that the game's various pickup items in the new renderer have now been made to be emissive, like the cross here on the rooftop. In the original game, emissive textures are used to keep things full bright even in the darkness, but they themselves cannot emit light. That's a typical rasterization thing. Like here, this checkpoint marker, which is bright red, but otherwise the area around it is completely dark. Or this health pickup here. As it bobs up and down in the darkness, we can see it being fully lit, but the area surrounding it has none of that light. Since the path tracer fully supports emissive lighting from an arbitrary surface, all of these emissive surfaces now cast light, making them stand out even more in the environment as they now light it up themselves and cause some fantastic shadowing effects of their own. One of the best aspects of this new emissive lighting comes from the enemy souls that they leave behind. Those always had a green glow before, but now it affects the environment as well, which gives the game's darker scene some rather fantastic contrast and some shadows that just were not there before. As I mentioned earlier, the game did extensively use physics objects in the original release, which tended to lead to a clash in lighting and shading for any moving objects, which were just incongruous with the then static baked lighting. Like here, these pillars fell to the ground and they could roll around, and in the 2004 renderer, we can see how they lack shadows. The static pillars on the sides here do have shadows, but the ones on the ground lack them. And then we can also see that their shading is much simplified in comparison to the environment. Turn on the path tracer and we can see now how even these moving objects are grounded into the environment with shadows of their own, and how they themselves receive and cast bounce lighting too, which grounds them further into the scene. The dynamic shadows are perhaps best noticed though on the game's largest moving objects, like the boss giant from this level. Now the giant actually has shadows cast from it, and you can see them moving on the terrain below, instead of the giant just being fully lit bright from all directions. Its titanic form is now constantly visible on this level in its shadow, which is massive on the ground. Now this is a big difference, but the total difference in lighting in many scenes typically just means that the lighting seems more physicalized, as dynamic objects now are properly integrated into it and no longer strangely glow or float oddly. One reason for this is due to lighting resolution. The original lighting was limited by trying to fit into a max of 256 megabytes of VRAM, and it was competing for space with the game's otherwise high-resolution textures. Now lighting and shadowing is done per pixel, in real time, in the path tracer, which by necessity means you will just see more nuance in the local lighting that wasn't there before. More shadows, more bounce lighting, as it is no longer being erased away by chunky textures that are being bilinearly filtered. Alongside dynamism and detail increasing, there are a couple of new effects too that I should mention. The lit fog, as I talked about earlier, is heavily used in a number of levels, and perhaps best in the Asylum level where the moonlight and rain is now lit up, and this gives that level much more ambiance than it had before. Another new effect that is occasionally used is lighting transmission effects from glass. Like here, we can see the stained glass windows in the game now filter light through them properly, coloring the light on the ground in the pattern of the individual mosaics on its surface. It's pretty neat. One of the biggest changes to the lighting though comes from an entirely new dimension of lighting, and that is specular lighting, which the original game had very little of. More often than not in the original game, lighting was primarily diffuse and diffuse only, which gives many of the original game scene a desert dry look to each surface, even if the surface was marble, wood, metal, or anything else that in real life would have some level of reflectance to it. For the RTX Remix renderer, that means the modders had to give surfaces new material types to give them any level of reflectivity, and this was done in a number of ways based upon what I can see. For some objects, like the ground we can see here in the first level, I believe modders used Quixel Megascan's assets to give the materials parallax and a high resolution that is not the original texture, but is broadly similar to it artistically. The stony ground in the graveyard is now a stony one, but with a different texture, achieving a similar effect, which has a rocky material with craggy bits and little crevices that obscure light and cast micro shadows. It looks pretty awesome, I think. These Quixel scanned textures look really awesome at times, like in the Asylum, where the ceramic tiles on the floor now show varying levels of depth and cracks in them that pick up a very dull level of reflectivity from the moonlit sky and atmosphere outside the game's windows. These full-on texture replacements, though, are used more sparingly throughout the game and are typically found on horizontal texture features, though they are found in a couple vertical examples, like here this replaced brick wall texture, which looks especially awesome, I would say. Another thing that the modders did to update the textures was apparently run them through some sort of generative tool, which interpreted the original texture's dark areas as recesses and lighter areas as raised edges, and then gave them a height map. And to be fair, this is the intent that they were probably authored with back in the day. This works really well at times, like we can see on this mason wall here, where the added in texture from the height map gives the grout on its surface much added depth, and those areas now pick up highlights and cast micro shadows behind them. This automated process works pretty well for textures whose baked features are easily interpreted, but for textures that had a lot of noise or were muddy, the automated process is a lot less successful. Take a look at this floor in the original 2004 game. Honestly, I'm looking at it and I'm still not sure what it is all these years later. It's low res and noisy with various dark spots. Perhaps it was supposed to be muddy ground in this courtyard here? Well, the automated texture generated for this ground here has a lot of pointy bits in it, where all that noise gives the ground now a kind of spiky look. This could look perhaps more natural with less depth to the height map, but that would require more human tuning. That is the main issue I would say with this RTX version so far, is that some of the automated generated textures have far too many bumps in them, giving them an unnatural appearance. But that is just the height map. The added in material values to these textures to give them a sheen, I would say looks universally great. As I mentioned earlier, the original game had barely any reflectivity, and now a number of select surfaces in the game show that effect in full. Take the most extreme example with the marble floors at the end of the game's second level, where the modders here gave them now a polished, pin-sharp reflective look, almost making them look like perfect old-school planar reflections you could find in a game like Serious Sam. Not all added in materials, though, showcase such sharp reflections. There's a diversity to them, like the few floors in the cathedral level, which have rough reflections, which start off sharp and then taper off to a more diffuse reflective look, with the scuffed areas on the floor breaking up the reflection's coherence. And some of the added in reflectivity to other textures is extremely subtle, like here in the final room at the end of the game's second level, where the ground only has the tiniest level of smoothness that catches hints of light from the torches. For the most part though, the remixed textures from this mod are very subtle, with many textures being just as diffused as found in the original game. Rock and dirt areas in particular look much the same as before, just with some more accurately rendered shadows and some added in bounce lighting that doesn't thankfully have a plasticky sheen to it that you might have typically found in a 7th generation game. There are a couple of other things that I like about this RTX version of Painkiller, like the added in glow on enemy eyes or weapons, which at times adds a lot of mood to the darker areas of the game. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the great per object motion blur, which is subtle, I will say, but it's just enough to make certain quick movements look extra slick, like the minigun spin. So the game does look great overall now, even in this work in progress state, but you have to remember that it is work in progress in a couple of areas. Some levels have definitely had less work on them than others, which you can see in some missing lighting or texture work at times, or some missing effects in some areas. And some things have yet to be replicated on the RTX renderer, like the rapidly rotating skies found on a number of levels. Still, it's impressive that you can download this for free as a mod to try on your PC. That is, of course, if your GPU is up to the task, and I don't think many will be. For the B-roll in this video, I played through the game's first 2 chapters and a bit of chapter 3, targeting 4K DLSS performance mode at 60 FPS, maxed remix settings on an RTX 5090. The best GPU there is at the moment, and it ran nearly every scene of the game at 60 FPS, even with tons of enemies and quite a lot of explosions going off. But that doesn't mean there were not a couple scenes which would cause it to tumble, and it would tumble consistently when it did. Those were typically those scenes with a lot of transparency. So outside the asylum, the GPU would be overburdened there by the rain and run around 50 FPS at times. You could also find that on the ice bridge level after the snow, that also could occasionally go below 60 FPS. The heaviest area that I found, though, so far was the swamp monster fight, which would regularly dip into the 50s, and at its heavier moments would dip even into the mid-40s. Being a user mod and still in development, I imagine this could change in later versions, but at the moment, RTX Remix Maxed Out is very heavy, and even heavier than Portal RTX, which I've covered in the past. So if you do want to play this game on a lower end GPU, I do recommend my optimized settings that I made for Portal RTX, which I've updated here for the most recent version of RTX Remix, which basically means turning down a number of light bounces and save on performance by skipping in a couple other areas. Still, even with that, an RTX 4060 was really struggling to run the game well. I had frame generation on and DLSS set merely to 1080p balanced with the transformer model, and it was at best 80 to 90 FPS in the game's general combat zones. But the heaviest levels I mentioned earlier were dipping into the 70s and even 60s with frame generation. That is not really good for playability in my book, and GPUs of this low caliber ought to turn down resolution even more at the moment, or honestly just wait till a little more optimization comes along, as that's always possible for future versions of this mod. And with that being said, I'm at the end of this video covering Painkiller RTX, a game that is still incredibly fun, and can manage to even look incredibly good if your hardware is up to the task in this work in progress version of the mod. Hopefully you liked my talking about it and I piqued your interest to checking it out. It is a classic FPS that deserves more accolades and renown than it typically gets. Anyway, like, subscribe, ring the bell, help on Patreon, follow on Blue Sky, and as always, this is Alex, bring you farewell und auf Wiedersehen.